You mean it doesn't get the...
Okay, we are live. Welcome to Boston Basic Income. I'm Alex Howlett. This week's topic is state level basic income. So what would it take to implement basic income at the level of like an individual state in the United States as opposed to at the level of the whole country? And analogously, you can think of, provinces in other countries as kind of like on the same level. So we've had discussions in here about global basic income, about city level basic income, about even private cities where you imagine that people pay to live in the city. So then you have kind of this flow of money where maybe people are getting basic income from the national government and then paying taxes into the city and that kind of thing. So we can ask the question, does it make sense to try to implement basic income at the level of an individual state? Does it make sense maybe as a stopgap measure if you don't have a national level basic income? Does it make sense to do it even if you do have a national level, basic income and have the state level basic income on top of that? And to kind of like, some of us read an article in the New York Times, a recent New York Times article called Social Programs Can Sometimes Turn a Profit for Taxpayers by Seema Jayachandran. So this article is thinking about an environment where you kind of have to get the money from taxes in order to fund social programs. So they're not emphasizing borrowing, they're not emphasizing printing money, and they're thinking of money as coming from taxpayers, which is maybe more true at the level of an individual state than it is at the level of the national government. So to get you guys kind of thinking to start, we can imagine these different scales of government. So you can imagine that you live in a building, a big apartment building or something like that. And you can think of that as being an institution. Should the landlord be paying basic income to all the tenants? Probably not. That doesn't make sense. At that scale. And then you can go up to like the next level scale. What if you live in like a gated community or something and you pay some kind of fee to be able to live in there? Does it make sense for that, the people, the internal government or organizational board or whatever to pay money to all the members? No, probably not. And then you can go to the level of the town or the city or the state or the nation or the whole world. And as you go up, it can start to make more sense to think about basic income going to everyone. And then maybe some people are net paying in and some people are net getting money out. Maybe at some of the higher levels, people are in aggregate getting more out than they're putting in. And some of the smaller scale levels, people are in aggregate putting more in than they're getting out, but they still have to be getting what they put in from somewhere, that kind of thing. So there's all these kinds of things. I don't really know the answers to some of these questions. So I kind of want to go around, get people's initial thoughts on what you think about the idea of state level basic income, anything about its feasibility or its desirability, anything along those lines. So let's go around. Let's start with Derek, Martin, and then Eddie.
I think, the intuition here is pretty sensible. If we think it's possible for basic income to be paid out on a federal level, then probably it can be paid out on a state level, but smaller. So the introductory level of the basic income, whatever level you're kind of first thinking about trying it out at, maybe you should be smaller. And if you were ever to try to maximize that or try to really push at the limits of that, you'd expect to run into limits quicker. And I think restrictions of local governments versus national governments on, making the policy tax funded, all of those, again, they add restrictions. It's going to make it harder to be as generous with the basic income as you might like. So I tend to think that basic income scales. The larger a network that we're connecting people with through money, the more money you can kind of put into the system to make it work. So it probably doesn't really make sense to talk about doing basic income on like a small city level, but maybe like a really large city, it starts to make sense. And maybe as a state, it really does make sense, even if it's not optimal. But there are challenges to it. You have to worry about like, what are the incentive changes when you have some people who are interacting, moving in and out of that state, they're not getting the basic income. What is it like for them living in this state where everyone else has a basic income, right? So that's generally how I look at it. Like, larger is better, but if the federal government's not paying out a basic income, I think a state doing it or a large city doing it would be a great way to test the waters and get people familiar with it.
Okay, cool. Let's go Martin and then Eddie and then Richard.
So let's sort of overview. To what I understand of Alex's sort of thinking on the economics of all this, and Alex will certainly correct me, but I sort of see a way that at state level it doesn't work, because at state level you don't have the same economics, you might say, structures and abilities that you have at a national level, sort of the way I see Alex's conception working. I'll go out of, I'll go out of domain for just a moment. And there's lots of talk about surveillance and visual, identification technologies and all that. And I'm not a huge supporter of sort of some of the legislation proposed at blocking some of that, solely because I think that type of technology can transcend borders. That is to say that other parties can violate your proposed restrictions. And so if you can't really solve the problem of something that's global with local proposals, I'd love to see, sort of more responsible use of certain kinds of technology, but I just don't think it can work. And so to just sort of bring that back to the basic income, and I'm not saying that basic income has to be global before it could be. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that it is one of these kinds of proposals that would benefit from analysis, like what we're going to do even this evening, which is sort of think about what are the differences between applying or attempting to implement a basic income at sort of different state levels or political entities, if you want to sort of call it that. And I'll leave it at that as far as kind of getting started.
Cool. Thanks, Martin. Let's go to Eddie, Richard, and then Austin.
So I'm a big fan of of implementing UBI, I would say, a statewide currency or even a local currency. If you can manage to get adoption with your local currency, and I think that on the world stage, the things that countries have to deal with their currencies is analogous to the problems that you'd have to solve with the statewide currency. Basically, I would say the game plan would be, stems from an understanding of the problem, which is that the current monetary system sends money to the top where it's not needed, and not enough money goes to the bottom level consumer, where the money is needed. So if you understand that to be the problem, then if you have a independent currency, you would want to raise interest rates in your currency, which actually would kind of would bring in capital from the world at the top, and then distribute it at the bottom with local currency. Another option, I think, for states, because currently states are now, with the crisis being, their borrowing is directly funded by the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is buying municipal and state level bonds. Another option would be to sell a lot of bonds and use that to fund a statewide basic income, while at the same time, I think it would be very important for the stability of your state government that you would need to hold back a good portion of the funds that you get from borrowing, hold that back as a reserve, so that you have stability with your state government, independent of the actions of the federal government and the Federal Reserve.
Yeah, lots of interesting stuff there. Kind of gets to the question of how can you, at the level of the state, figure out how to print more money or introduce additional money without having to get it from somewhere necessarily. Let's
Yeah.
go to Richard, Austin, and then Dwight.
Well, there already is a state level basic income, the Alaska Permanent Fund. It's just not that high. It's $1,000 to $2,000 a year, which is equivalent to like $100 to $200 a month or something. And the way that they fund it is with a royalty on minerals and oil, and 25% of those royalties go into the Alaskan Permanent Fund, and the states of New York or Illinois could, well, have a financial gains tax on like the stock market or the, what's it called, the goods market or whatever in Illinois, Chicago. That's just one, some of the basic ways you could fund one.
Yeah, I think you're talking about the commodities exchange. Yeah. So let's go to Austin, Dwight, and then Bethany.
Hey, yeah, look, I like the idea of a layered basic income. I think there's probably about 5 layers that which you could potentially pay a basic income. One is global, another is regional. So the EU or the African Union, for example, could pay a regional or continental basic income. It's especially important in the EU, since the EU is actually the currency issuer. The national governments have surrendered their currencies, which I think was dumb. Then you have national, state, and local. And I also agree with what Eddie was saying, that you could potentially have local currencies and state currencies. And before you mentioned something about how people pay to live in private communities. Actually, we pay to live in public communities too, right? Every municipality charges land rates. So either you're a landowner or you're renting from someone, so you're paying that indirectly. And one way to guarantee the currency would be to charge a portion of those land rates in the local currency, which would then give you the ability to issue it. And it would probably be, a net benefit for everyone except really big landholders or people who have, very valuable property in the center of town or something like that. And I think one thing that's interesting about it is that we talk about basic income sometime as another monetary lever, as another inflationary lever that can be used. What happens when you start to have these more granular geographical payments is it becomes a migration lever as well. So if you want to encourage migration, you have a high one. If you want to discourage migration, you make it lower than comparable places. And you could even go negative and have, a head tax if you're really worried about, like you want to actually drive people out of the region. So if you're a small region or a small country that's desperate to get more remittances, you actually want to get people to leave so they can send back foreign currency, or you're worried about water supply or some other scarcity, some of the real scarcity in your region, like there's not enough land or water or whatever, you could actually incentivize people to emigrate by having a negative basic income or a head tax, right? So it becomes this complicated lever, which opens up all these possibilities, including a lot of possibilities to screw up and for there to be competition and disharmony between the different units. So it's a fantastically complicated subject, this one, but I still think that complexity could be overcome and it could be overall beneficial. We've even seen a local currency come into being recently in some American town that they'd done it during the Great Depression, and then they fired up the old printing press again recently to create local currency that you can only spend at local businesses, which they give to people on very low incomes there. So more like a guaranteed minimum income. But I think it's a lot more possible and than people, I think, generally intuit. But it's not without risks and complications.
Okay, cool. There's lots to talk about there. Let's go Dwight, and then Bethany, and then Ian. So Dwight, you got to unmute yourself. You there, Dwight? Here, I can unmute you if you're talking. Or can I? Huh. When I click unmute on you, it doesn't unmute you. Well, let's go to Bethany and then Ian, and then we'll try to get back to Dwight.
Hey, so one other thing I think about with basic income at the state level is that even if you were spending the same amount on social programs, we've talked before about the benefit of basic income is its simplicity, and it kind of goes to everyone more easily. So you don't have to jump through hoops to get it. And that could help it reach people better. And then you can kind of tax on the other side if you want to be kind of fiscally similar to like a more of a targeted program that people have to qualify for. So it seems like at the very least, that would be a possible application of basic income at even the city or the state level. That would be kind of equivalent to social programs that might be at the state or city level, or could be added in addition and then see if it does better. But yeah, that seems like another benefit that isn't dependent on maybe the way that money works at the national level, but could also apply to how money works at the state level.
Cool. So give everyone a basic income and then tax it away from some people instead of just giving money to some people.
Yeah, just because as we've talked about, people often don't get that money when they should because it's so hard to like show that you qualify and all these kinds of things. So
Right.
It would be better to give it as the default, and then the onus is on the government, as you've talked about, Alex, to kind of figure out how to get it back.
How to do the taxes, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go to Ian and then Dwight, if your sound is working, and then Dan.
Yeah, so I guess like state level basic income. I mean, the first thing I thought of was also what you have said. I've heard you say, Alex, that like a smaller version of a basic income is not a good way to mimic like universal basic income. And so I don't know, if it would, if people would feel more comfortable like implementing a basic income early on a smaller level, because maybe if it didn't work out well, then the failure wouldn't be as bad, but it wouldn't mimic the large scale anyway. So so yeah, I don't know. It seems like there's other benefits to a smaller version, like a state level versus national level of basic income. So I guess it's interesting to see, what those are. So yeah, those are my thoughts.
Okay, cool. Dwight, is your sound working now, or maybe you can't hear us either? Yeah, you're still muted. I don't know, if for some reason I can't unmute you. Usually I have an unmute button, and when I click it, nothing happens. I don't know what's going on there. Well, let me know if you figure that out, and we'll get to you. You can also type stuff in the chat if you want to say things in the Zoom chat. You can see that at the bottom of your screen. There's a chat bubble there. You can click on and type things. So let's go to Dan, and then Elizabeth, and then David.
Yeah, so just a couple of thoughts. I think a state basic income, while not being as effective as a national one, is probably a little bit politically easier to implement because we're so deficit focused in the US, and states are already sort of budget constrained in terms of having, I think it's like 28 states have balanced budget amendments. So it kind of, I feel like it might just be easier because you sort of have to come up with something to quote unquote pay for it, even though it's not as effective. And I do like the idea of a state basic income, but I think it would be targeted. It would work well if it was sort of thought about as targeted for some sort of thing. So if you want to provide people with enough money for food or housing or something like that, you're still giving people cash, but it's sort of based on that kind of an amount, because it just has to cost it has to be within a reasonable cost for it to even get anywhere. So I think, something like $300, which is sort of a food budget, $500, somewhere in there seems like a feasible amount. I think obviously it would be easier for states like Alaska that have a natural resource that they could use to fund it. But I also think, you could fund it with some sort of tax. Obviously, an idea I have or I've thought about is sort of, I guess it's sort of a grandiose idea, but for billionaires to, instead of giving all their money away to charities or starting foundations and things like that, they could just create social wealth funds with their billions of dollars, and that could be used in some sort of way to have a state level basic income. I don't know how feasible that is. I just think it's a better use of that money. I don't know. Yeah.
All right, good stuff. And it looks like we have Dwight back now. Do you have any initial thoughts on state level basic income, Dwight?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Well, I'm from Canada, just so you know. So I guess the equivalent of a state is a province.
Yep.
Well, the examples I can use is that we had a pilot project in Ontario with a few municipalities that we were trying out the basic income before the new provincial government came in and scrapped it. But I guess the scenario that I would say about a state government is basically, what are you trying to address with the basic income? If you have a basic income and you figure that it's going to cut down on criminality, or it's going to cut down on I don't know, mental issues or whatever, and I would assume that there would be a concomitant lesser amount on some of these things. So in other words, if you're adding money for the basic income, you have to spend less money on something else, because the basic income is addressing a problem that we had with some other issues. So in the criminal system or the mental health system is going to be better because of the state income. So you spend less money there. So you're really transferring one set of money to another. If I look at the thing with the coronavirus, we had a sort of, I guess, not an official basic income, but a recognition that people need a certain amount of money to live. And that's basically why people were given money during the coronavirus. So whatever the logic being is that you have to have a certain amount to live, whether it's because you already had that money or whether you need to have that money. I think the most efficient way, obviously, of getting across the country is doing it on a national basis, but on getting it implemented, I think a state or provincial basis, if you look at Canada, would be at least a good way of trying it, experimenting with it to see if it could go national.
Yeah, I think you bring up some good points, especially with the fiscal trade-offs there, that if you're spending money on basic income, maybe that's less money you're spending on something else. So let's go to Elizabeth, and then David, and then Joan.
Yeah, I appreciated Bethany's point about possibly sort of taxing the money back afterwards, because one of my big concerns about doing it at the state level would be sort of the same as the city level and other smaller ones that we've talked about, where because of the fiscal constraints, municipal governments have to take funding from somewhere else. And so I would worry that it would be like, oh, great, we're going to give people this basic income, so now we don't need to fund XYZ services, without any actual guarantee that the basic income is enough that people aren't going to need those services, or that there aren't going to be some other sort of reasons why those services would still be necessary. And so I appreciate the sort of simplicity of okay, just give people money, and then if you're worried about the balanced budget, if you worry that it's not gonna somehow be okay, great, now people are using the services less, so it balances out naturally. If you're worried about that, you could just tax rich people more, which seems like a great idea. Generally, to Dan's point about a social wealth fund, I'm yeah, or we could just tax billionaires a lot. That's a great way to create a social wealth fund. The government can do that. Yeah, I think those are my thoughts at this time.
Yeah, that can be tricky at the state level because then maybe the billionaires will move to another state. But you never know. You know.
I would like the national government to tax billionaires.
Yeah. Let's go to David and then Joan.
Well, Alex, during your introduction, you had a really good insight on how to look at how this issue scales down, and you suggested that it would be possible to tax, to have a basic income for people who are living in a building. But I don't think so. I think you could. I think you actually could implement a basic income with in a small setting where you just had a few families living together. I think of like a co-housing community or even just a regular apartment complex. There's these common areas that people share, and they use these common assets that the community owns collectively, and they're charged, and everyone is charged for the use of those, for the cost of maintaining and upkeeping those assets. But but you're usually charged based on the amount of based on your own personal assets. So if you have a bigger home, you're charged more. Essentially, it's like the HOA functions like a property tax based on the value of or the size of your living quarters. So it would be likely if you're living in a condominium that if you had the top floor penthouse, you would pay a larger HOA fee, and you would only use the same. You'd only have the same swimming pool to swim in. So small communities do wealth redistribution in that way, and it scales up to to a city and to a state level the same way. I think it certainly is. It isn't radical to suggest doing that, but I think that what it misses is what we need to ask ourselves is what problem are we trying to solve here, and I don't know that UBI is the best way to solve all of the things we're trying to tackle with it. There's a host of problems with means-tested programs, but a well-implemented means-tested program that's paid for with tax dollars is a feasibility, especially when you're talking about on a smaller scale. The more granular you get with your community, the more you know what the needs that a means-tested program could become. On a really small scale, the tax system is essentially going to function like a means-tested system anyhow. You're going to have to figure out what assets people have, and so I don't know that the UBI on a state level and at a city level, well, I think they're possible. I don't know that it solves that basic problem that UBI solves, and Alex talks about this all the time, is it fixes the problem of how do we get consumers money. And I don't know that's taken care of at a state level, unless the state is somehow, importing money, unless it's bringing in a lot of wealth, unless they're net exporter of goods and services, and they're importing the money. Maybe then a UBI would be a way of making sure that the economy doesn't become, really top heavy or favor those industries and those sectors that are doing the exporting. Those are my thoughts.
Yeah, those are good thoughts. I like what you said about smaller communities, that it can be efficient to allocate resources, and just because everyone knows each other and you can get the incentives right, and you don't really need something like a basic income necessarily when you get really, really small scale. So the question is, when does it start to become useful? Is it useful at the level of the state? Let's go to Joan.
Yeah, so kind of related to what David was just talking about, the first thing that struck me about the article was the focus more on social services, which is not usually the focus here on UBI. It's about how to get consumers money and how to stimulate the economy at large, although social service is part of that. But it seems like it's flipped in thinking about state level basic income and not universal basic income. Then we're talking about how to help people in kind of more directed and targeted ways than we talk about usually when we talk about stimulating the economy at large with the UBI. The other thing that struck me was somebody talked about the different state needs As the coronavirus shows, different states, they're having trouble at the federal government level responding to requirements for coronavirus because of different states' statistics. I mean, similarly, different states have different, kind of economies and financial needs, and all of that has to be dealt with, and it's much more complicated than the simplicity of UBI at a federal level, where it's not taken into much consideration who needs what in a local sense, and it's not means tested, which it might end up being at the state level. So those are my thoughts.
Yeah, those are good thoughts. I just want to mention, or I want to point out that anytime we're talking about the economy or we're talking about economic policy, we are talking about how to help people, at least in some sense. So even when we're talking about a national level basic income, we're asking, what resources are most efficiently allocated by the government and which resources are best allocated by the market for the benefit of people. It all comes back to helping people be better off.
But it also, you focus on stimulating the economy, and apart from that.
I would be careful about using the word stimulating the economy too. We did one of these on stimulus as well. So a lot of times when people talk about stimulus, they're talking about like helping businesses, getting spending going. We don't necessarily need people to be spending more, but we want them to have access to the benefit that the economy can provide them. And that's what basic income does. That's what money does. It gives you access to the economy. We don't want to force people to spend money necessarily. So at the level of the state, we can ask similar questions. We can ask, which resources are most efficiently allocated by the market, which resources are most efficiently allocated by the government. But when you have this kind of tax revenue constraint that's more binding at the level of the individual state, then you have to start making trade-offs. To what extent is basic income going to help people more than another kind of spending or spending on some other program that you would have done, that kind of thing. So Dwight was kind of bringing this up, right? If you are putting more money into basic income, you're maybe putting less money into something else. And that's true kind of at the budget level, but the article kind of talks about how, different kinds of spending can maybe increase the amount of other spending you can do and that kind of thing. So there's a little more nuance there, and it's certainly more complicated than maybe at the level of an individual, city that's trying to allocate money and that kind of thing. And I wanted to also call back to the point that Bethany and Elizabeth brought up, which is the idea that you could implement, you could do the exact same distribution that you have now, but have it be basic income combined with taxes and get the same distribution of income or benefits to people. But then you're making it more obvious, who's being taxed, how much, that kind of thing. And you can start to think, well, do we really want to tax all the basic income back away from the poor and that kind of thing? So it can kind of shift the way you think about it. The simplest way to implement basic income at any level is, or at the level of the state especially, is to say, okay, we're giving everyone a basic income of some small amount, I don't know, $10 a month, and we're also imposing a tax of the exact same amount. So everybody pays nothing and gets nothing, but you have these mechanisms in place, and then you can start making adjustments from there. Maybe you increase the amount so everyone pays $1,000 and gets $1,000, and then you say, well, wait a minute, why are we taxing all the poor people in the state $1,000? Maybe we want to tax them less and figure out how to do that. It makes it, it changes the framing, so it makes it obvious that that the current system is taxing poor people. And it's just a reframing of what we're already doing, but it can kind of bring it up to consciousness. And then you also have the infrastructure in place, so you have everything in place to pay out a basic income, and then you can kind of make adjustments from there. So I think that's an interesting approach to kind of start doing this kind of thing. So go ahead, Dan, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to David's point. And I think it's right that you kind of got to delineate between a national basic income and a state basic income, which is kind of why I brought up the notion of targeting sort of a specific security thing, like food or housing. I think at the national level, a basic income is definitely, as Alex talks about, a way to get money to consumers so that the economy can function properly. And I think at the state level, a basic income would be more of a social justice, anti-poverty kind of thing, because it's just at a smaller amount. So it's going to necessarily be a smaller amount. And so you can just make it to be, we're going to make sure everybody can buy food on a monthly basis, or we're going to make sure everybody, has access to they have access to housing. And so they have access to housing through like a cash grant. Not, again, it's not for that, but it's just you're sort of thinking about, okay, what's the median rent or what's the median grocery bill, and so picking an amount based off of that, sort of as a guiding principle.
Yeah, I think you can kind of make those guesses or kind of estimations to see to kind of like come up with some kind of starting point. I think ultimately the goal would be at any level, basic income at any level would be to kind of like maximize the benefit that people are getting. So that, and then trying to figure out what level of basic income maximizes that, and what level of other things we need too. If we're trading off. I like to say that the economy is a giant anti-poverty program. It's already like that's what it's for. The government is for, the government is for helping people, but the economy is for helping people be better off too. Like that's why we have an economy, because it benefits us to have an economy, and we want that to be working as well as possible for people. To make sure that there's a minimum amount of poverty and a maximum amount of prosperity and all of that kind of thing. It's just the answers to these questions the dynamics of it start to look a little bit different when you're kind of not at the level of the whole country, and what are the right policies. Let's go to Eddie.
So I think it's really important to talk about and think about what exactly creates the need for basic income, and what problem exactly basic income is solving. I think one of the very interesting things, if you look at economic history, is the Great Depression in 1930, and the current crisis that we have now with unemployment at 25%, 30 to 50% people facing eviction in their homes. And if you look at the per capita GDP, if you look at how much the economy produced per person from 1800 to the 1930s to 2020, it's like a five-fold increase from 1800 to 1920. The economy, produces much more. We're, as a whole, much more wealthy in 1930 than we are in 1800. And again, in 2020, we're 10 times more wealthy in terms of total production than we were in 1930. But yet we have this very interesting phenomenon that despite this enormous increase in production, we still have this problem in 1930 and again in 2020, where a huge portion of the population, 25 to 30%, have trouble getting an income, and as a result have trouble with rent, have trouble with buying food to feed their families. It's a very strange phenomenon, and the reason behind it, I would assert, is that we haven't examined the effects of productivity growth, where we're increasing production, but we're decreasing the need for labor, and most people earn their income through labor. So at the same time that we're increasing production, but we're decreasing people's income, and that's a conflict, because people use their income to come back and buy the production in the first place. So yeah. I'll try to keep this short in a nutshell.
Okay.
But that really the what's going on is that the productive capacity is that is that you're increasing production, but you're clamping down on people's income, and as a result, people are under consuming. They don't have money to buy what the economy can produce. So I would argue that the basic income is a monetary, like the basic tool, the basic method, which fits most easily at the federal level where they're creating money, is that when they create the money, they should be sending it to all the consumers, so that people have money to buy what the economy can produce. It has very little to do with taxing billionaires. You can actually tax them or not tax them, and that has very little effect on being able to send out a basic income. It has more to do with I think it's more centrally a monetary thing, and you should be sending. Right now, we're sending trillions, onto the debt markets through monetary policy, and instead we should be sending that money to consumers and not onto debt markets.
Okay, yeah, I certainly think a lot of what you're saying is true, especially at the national level or at the level of the monetary zone, where governments can borrow and then the central banks can buy up that government debt. But like you were saying at the beginning, the Fed is now starting to buy up state and municipal debt. So maybe there's some of that now, that could be happening at the state level as well. When that's not happening, I guess in my mind, I'm thinking about a scenario in which that's not happening. Maybe that's the new normal. Maybe that's going to be happening from now on. But in a scenario where that's not happening, we do kind of have to think more about where to get the money from. I liked at the beginning when you brought up that, ideas for how states could create more money. Like maybe they create an alternative currency and create their own monetary institutions. And someone, I think it was David, maybe it was Dave, I don't know who it was. Someone brought up the Eurozone, and that, oh no, it was Austin, that maybe it was a mistake for all these countries that had their own currency and could do their own monetary policy to kind of merge into one currency zone where they don't have that flexibility anymore. So then the question is, how do you go in the other direction? And you can talk about undoing the euro and having each country in the Eurozone going back to having its own currency. But you could think about something like that similar in the United States, where each state maybe tries to have its own currency, or maybe you have like a Massachusetts exit or something like that from the dollar zone, and we have our own mass bucks or something. I'm not convinced that that's the best way to go, but it's certainly an interesting idea and something we're thinking about. So yeah, I think those are a lot of interesting points, Eddie. Oh, and also to your point about increased productivity and less of a need for labor, I think that's true that that's happening. But I also like that you brought up productive capacity, because our productive capacity is increasing much faster than our production, and we're not necessarily able to activate the full productive capacity because people's incomes are being restricted to what they get from jobs. So I think there's, I think, a bunch of people have brought up, well, what's the problem we're trying to solve? What's the problem that basic income solves? And I think it's the same problem at the level of the state or the level of the nation or the global level. It solves the problem of how to give ordinary people access to what the market can produce for them. It solves the problem of how to get money to consumers so they can buy things. You're giving people money so they can buy stuff. It's, when you say it like that, when I say it like that, it probably sounds pretty straightforward. But then, the question is, if we look at a state like Alaska, as Richard brought up before, that already has something like a basic income, to what extent is giving people money to be able to buy things costing society in other ways because you're not directing that money towards roads and bridges and schools and that kind of stuff. And I think those trade-offs are real. They're real at the national level in terms of resources. At the state level, you can, of course, you're pulling resources from different things, but you're also thinking more in terms of allocating a limited amount of money. So those are all kinds of things to think about. So let's go to Austin.
Hey, so this group's amazing and it raises a lot of really interesting points. So what I had my hand up for the first time has kind of changed now. But I wanted to really quickly go through a couple of things. One, if you have the EU example or the Massachusetts exit example, they don't have to necessarily leave the currency zone. They could have their local currency and the larger area currency in circulation simultaneously. That's not without risk, but there's advantages to it as well, to having both things happening. The other thing was, someone mentioned, the point of the economy is to, as Alex mentioned, the point of the economy is to help people. That's one reading of it. You could take a more cynical reading, and the idea, which is kind of built into a lot of sort of anarchist thinking, but also like MMT, that actually the economy is this trap that's used to mobilize the population and stop them sort of autonomously taking care of themselves, and sort of drag them into this bigger collective so that they can, be used to then raise armies and build public works and, work in factories and do all these things which allow the ruling class of a society to become more powerful. And that relates to competition with outside powers. So, you want to raise an army to fight the French, you're the English, you want to fight the French, you want to pay your soldiers, but they don't need, but that, you've got to make them value money and bring them into the cash economy. So then you can pay the soldiers and they'll accept those wages to go and fight or whatever. But the issue of the problem that's being solved, I think, is one thing that's different at the state level is that you have another problem, or when you're talking about smaller geographical zones, the problem shifts away from just poverty to the related problem of migration. So lots of rural areas, or even just smaller cities now, are facing net emigration, where they're losing people, and they want people to stay, especially young people, but the young people can't make a good enough living where they are, and so they move, right? But so if you had localized or state basic incomes, you could adjust that, and it doesn't even necessarily need to be that it's greater in the rural or poorer area, because the cost of living may be lower there. So rent is $400 more a month in Sydney than it is where I am. So even if the basic income here was lower than Sydney, but it was only $200 lower, it would still make more. It would still make sense to stay. So I think that, and of course, those problems like how you get people money and where people live are related. So and again, like when you think about what's the problem you're trying to solve, the more theoretical you're being, the more you can focus on just one. And then as you move away from theory towards actually policy and implementation, all of a sudden you have to be thinking about multiple things at once. And, at the state level, that would be extremely true, because each state has different problems and, different cost of living and different migration pressures.
Yeah, I think those are some really good points. And I certainly agree with you that you could use something like a regional or localized basic income as a tool to create incentive for immigration. I guess a question I would have is when you would want to do something like that. So I guess on off the top of my head, I have a hard time imagining a time where you'd want to. I mean, basic income, you're paying people to move to a place. That's not necessarily the intention, but that's always going to be the result. But I have a hard time imagining when you would want to do it for that reason. Do you have any kind of examples or anything, Austin?
Yeah, well, I just know that, for example, where I live, it's a country town in Australia, right? And it's considered a problem that young people especially leave, right? It's considered a problem that working age people, they finish high school and they basically end up drifting off to the city looking for work, and that that depresses the local economy. And a lot of the time will be about keeping people rather than bringing people. And the other reason that I think it would be important is if people don't actually want to move. Like, I don't want to leave my family. I don't want to spend this with the global basic income. I think this becomes really important, because these women from the Philippines who leave their own families to go take care of kids in Saudi Arabia or the United States or whatever. And so they're leaving behind their children to go take care of someone else's children, so they can send back money in the form of remittances, because the poverty is so terrible, right? So poverty and immigration are just completely wound up together to me. So what you're doing is poverty is an immigration pressure, and you're removing that pressure and giving people the option of staying where they are, which I think is obviously good because you're increasing people's choice. Of course, you're also giving people more money so that they have the option of leaving if they want. So we don't know what would happen, and this is why. So if you introduce a national basic income, it might be that all of a sudden people are leaving the country faster. We were wrong, you know what I mean? And everyone's like, now I've got a bit more cash in my pocket. I want to go to the city and have a good time, right? I'm prepared to take that risk. And then the regions that are losing people might say, well, we better up our basic income to give people a reason to stay. Or we're going to have all these problems of, like a Detroit style thing where everybody leaves and there's all these abandoned buildings and, all this wasted capacity and economic depression.
Yeah, those are some good points. Thanks for kind of elaborating on that. I think it's an interesting question too, because at our level, we probably care about people, but at the level of individual regions and their governments, they care about their region, they care about their state, they care about their city. So they might have an incentive to use basic income in this way to pull people in. But then, again, basic income is one among many possible government services, and anytime you're providing a service, a government service, you're doing it to kind of improve the well-being of your people, to make them better off, that kind of thing. A lot of these things are probably going to attract people. If you're somewhere that has better internet, better infrastructure, that kind of thing, that attracts better schools, that attracts people. But then again, like we talked about in the geographic mobility discussion, there are some benefits that are very hard, that kind of get in the way of people moving. So maybe you provide benefits to people who already live there, but not to people who come in or something like that. So basic income is certainly, well, it depends on how you implement it. If you say like, oh, well, people who, move here, they only get basic income after, having established residency for some period of time, then that maybe doesn't create as much of an incentive to move. Like even in Alaska, I think you have to be a resident for a year before you get the permanent fund dividend. So there's those kinds of restrictions too. You might want to have that if you want to provide your people a benefit, but you don't want, a sudden rush of new people in that you can't support, that kind of thing. So there's all kinds of interesting complications there. Yeah, go ahead.
Real quick, one reason you might do a basic income over, better internet or one of these other indirect or, infrastructure style incentives is that you can adjust it really easily. You can just change the number month to month or whatever to, if you realize, oh my God, we haven't done enough, or oh no, we've done too much. Everybody's coming to get, the free internet or whatever. Like you've just got something that you can adjust really easily and at sort of at will to some extent. One other thing I remembered is you mentioned before that you might tax people back. You introduce a basic income, then you tax it back. To me, that sort of loses some of the advantage, because what you want with money is you want it to flow through the economy. So you kind of want to put it in one place and take it out somewhere else. So you would probably, I always think you want to give it to poor people and take it from rich people, because that's not just because of, a social justice urge, although that's real, but also because that's kind of how the economy works. The economy kind of moves from consumers to the owners of capital. So if you want to increase that flow, you put more in the hands of consumers and you take more from people who own like buildings or factories or whatever. So you charge a land tax rather than a head tax, or you charge a capital tax rather than, makes sense to me. But yeah, that's another aside.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And when I was suggesting, giving people money and just taking it back again, that has no effect on kind of the people's lives at that point. It has an effect on how we think about things, and it has an effect on maybe the legal structures that we've set up and the infrastructure that we've set up. So it makes it easier it's like a stepping stone. It makes it easier to move to the next step. Like right now, when we talk about implementing basic income, a lot of people worry that it's going to be at the expense of other programs. But if you already have the basic income in place and you have this like kind of offsetting head tax in place, then it becomes more obvious that what you're doing right now, the current system is taxing the poor, if you frame it in this way. And then people are like, well, wait a minute, maybe we don't want to tax the poor. Maybe that's a bad idea. So that kind of like it'll maybe jog people's framing of things and help them think about it in a different kind of like moral way or that kind of thing. Let's go to Derek.
That's one way to frame it, but it can also be tricky because, I don't think people are used to thinking of the idea of lack of basic income as a tax. I think that makes sense for people who are thinking about basic income as a piece of economic infrastructure that we're kind of missing, but that's pretty foreign to most people. I think that I think a lot of us feel that probably the ideal way to do a basic income would be larger, nationally, federally. But we are looking at this from this perspective of, okay, we have a budget restricted local government. Traditionally, we think of them taxing their citizens and then paying out the basic income. So how do we do that? How do we solve that problem? How do we get around that in the most efficient way without introducing other problems or sacrificing other programs that these states are already doing that we might want to keep, right? And we don't want to introduce incentive problems. So one way to think about it is kind of along the lines that this article brings up, which is where they look at other social spending, not basic income, but other ways that we've spent money to help the poor or help people that otherwise end up becoming burdens on welfare systems and that kind of thing. It turns out, oh, a lot of these policies save money. And there's sort of two ways that they talk about saving money. One is that, okay, well, when you help them when they're young and later they grow up, they earn more and that's more tax revenue. And then a second way is by reducing costs, right, to the state. There's actually, you're reducing the burden on existing welfare programs that are addressing poverty, right? So when you think of it that way, I mean, there's a theory you could come up with, which is that, well, there's a certain amount of spending the local government is already doing in the traditional currency, the one it's already using, that it's are only problems that exist because we lack the basic income. And if that's true, theoretically, there may be a revenue neutral amount of basic income that you could introduce over the course of a fiscal year for any state province. That's not necessarily the case, but if it is true that we're spending a lot on poverty and we only need to do that because we lack a basic income, you could, in a fiscally conservative way, pledge to raise the basic income gradually over the course of a fiscal year, and stop raising it if you notice that expenditures, caseloads of these other programs stop dropping, right? Now, I don't know if it would even it out exactly, but it does allow you to say, we're only going to be spending it, putting in the basic income in a way that's saving us money. And that might be counterintuitive to some people, but it's not that counterintuitive because it's actually, that's the way a business works. A business they spend money they don't have first, right? And then they end up, okay, this saved us money in the long run. This earned us money in the long run. And so that would be interesting, I think, to say, run an experiment and say, does basic income save us money over the course of a fiscal year? If it does, then why wouldn't we? Why wouldn't we do it?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I often like to compare basic income to other services that the government provides or could provide. And one of the closest analogies, I think, is healthcare, because we don't always frame healthcare as kind of a welfare program. Everybody needs healthcare and everybody needs money, right? And in our society, in our economy, we're often expecting people to get these things from jobs. But I think people are maybe a little bit further along in thinking about healthcare as something that's maybe more efficient to be provided by the government. That, society as a whole saves money and economizes on resources by providing healthcare in this more efficient way. And I think the same thing can be true of basic income. And I like what you said, Derek, of the idea of kind of gradually increasing the basic income and then seeing how much money it saves us. And that's kind of analogous to, hey, now the government is starting to provide more healthcare. How much money does that save us? So I really like that. Let's go to Dan.
Yeah, so related to that and slightly switching gears, just curious if we think it's better for the actual state government to administer the basic income or if it's better to do it in like a public-private partnership with something like a nonprofit in terms of, and related to what you guys are talking about with, data collection, and you want to see certain results change as you raise the basic income. It leads to like sort of, I guess, my instincts about sort of corruption and things like that. Do you want to have it somewhat like be run by something that's adjacent to the government and not necessarily the government itself, because a certain like in Ontario, I think it was, right? It was started by one. The experiment was started by one political party, and then the next one came in and didn't like it. And so it's like, how do you deal with those sorts of things? Is it better to have it administered by an adjacent organization or just the state government itself?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it kind of just brings to attention the idea that there's always this. You have to kind of decide whether something's better, implemented through the market or through the government. So clearly, the government isn't disciplined by market incentives. So then there's room for inefficiency creep and corruption and that kind of thing to emerge without kind of anything pushing back against it. If you have a private business in a competitive environment, then if you become corrupt and inefficient, then you go out of business, or at least that's kind of in an ideal scenario, you would have that. So we can ask about when it's useful to have market incentives and people playing by the rules of the market, and how to set the parameters for the market that in such a way that it provides the most benefit to people. So this gets kind of back to the question of basic income at different scales. So when we had our discussion about private cities, we talked about, okay, well, if you're a private city and you're trying to maximize your profit, then the way you do that is by being a really good city that people want to live in. So you do that by providing the service that actually benefits people the most, and you create that incentive. And then people can kind of choose which city to live in based on which city is, doing the best stuff, and you could pay more to live in really good cities and that kind of stuff. Would you want that at the level of the state? Would you want the state to be kind of competing for people by providing benefits? But then if you do that, then the flow of basic income you'd kind of expect to be from the national level, and then each state is kind of like trying to compete for individual people's spending because they have the money, and now you're trying to provide the best services to get that money coming into your state. Obviously, that's the opposite of a state level basic income. It's each state is kind of taking money from people in exchange for providing something else. But that's not really what you were getting at. That was kind of a tangent that I went off on. The question is about public-private partnerships and when is it more efficient? And it's really, really hard to say. I think once
definitely
you have,
not. I was just gonna say definitely not a profit generating business, but a nonprofit type thing.
Right. For sure. And even private cities don't necessarily have to be for profit, but they still have to bring in enough revenue not to fail as a business, which nonprofits have to do as well. But yeah, for a public-private partnership, it's an interesting question because once you've contracted a private company to do your work, then some of the same kinds of inefficiencies and problems can kind of creep over to the private company because now they have this government contract and that kind of thing. So then the question is, how do you maintain that market discipline when you're hiring a private company, that kind of thing? I don't know the answers to these questions. I'm just, there's like a lot of wrinkles there. But I think you bring up an interesting point, and I imagine that sometimes doing it that way is better, and finding ways for companies to compete to provide these services efficiently is probably a good idea. Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, it was real quick. I was just gonna say, I think that the prospect of losing that government contract would be what would be a check against a potential check against the sorts of things you're talking about.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Yep. So let's go to Austin.
Hey, two things. One, I remembered something else I wanted to say before, Eddie, and because you guys mentioned jobs and how you get healthcare from jobs and your income from jobs. And before Eddie said, well, most people are still in jobs. That's actually not true for the first time in US history. If you Google it now, it's down to 1 in 2 Americans have a job. So that's people who are on, Social Security or left the labor force for some other reason or whatever. It's now down to, 50%. So we've hit the halfway mark where half the population is not in paid labor. So, that's, You can talk about all the different reasons for that, but I think it's going to be an inevitable trend. And it was funny because I was arguing on Reddit with someone about a basic income, and they said, well, if half the population stops working, how's the other half supposed to provide for them? And it's like, well, that's already the case. And we could probably go lower by, you know, removing some service sector jobs and still have everything that we actually need. But regarding the public-private partnership or a nonprofit, I would suggest that you wouldn't really want a nonprofit. I think they're just as prone to corruption as everybody else. And the cure to corruption is a free and thriving press, which is what I'm doing in my day job, trying to fix that, but that's another story. But what you might want is like the Reserve Bank, or sorry, the Federal Reserve, you guys call it. You might, some kind of quasi-independent governmental institution, sort of like, you know, the reserve head is appointed a bit like a judge. They're meant to be appointed and then the politicians are meant to step back. I mean, at the federal level, you could just make it something the Reserve Bank does. The Reserve Bank is now the issuer of the global basic, of the national basic income, right? I don't think you have those at the state level. You don't have a state Reserve Bank, but maybe you create one, especially if you're creating your own currency. And they do both interest rates and basic income as their two monetary levers, and you give it some distance from the government, and you give it this kind of this quasi-independence like we've given to reserve banks, so that it has some protection from just you know, the changing political winds.
Yeah, I like that. I think that's related to kind of what Eddie was getting at before with creating institutions that allow states to issue more of their own currency or to borrow at a higher capacity, that kind of stuff. Yeah. Let's go to Richard.
About how Ontario, I think it was, implemented a basic income with one party and then another party, well, revoked it or whatever. Well, the person who's been fighting for like 30 years to implement basic income in Canada said that if you worry about what will happen after you implement something, nothing will ever get done. So they can like implement a basic income and then they can like cut all the other social programs. Well, you can fight to increase the basic income enough to compensate for the loss of all those programs or something. It's just how you you have to do something to even out the bottom. Someone will notice. People won't notice all these programs because most people do not get those programs. But everyone gets a basic income, so they would notice something happening to it. Yeah,
that's certainly true. It's more like Social Security insurance. If you're in the United States, it's something that everyone's aware of. It's very visible, very public. I think most people just have kind of a nebulous idea of, you know, safety net programs and government benefit programs and what they do and that kind of thing. And there's been a lot of changes in that area, and I don't think most people are aware of the changes that have happened over the last few decades. I think those are some good points. That's a good point, Richard. Let's go to Derek.
I really like what Austin was saying about the semi-independent fiscal authority on the national level, and that sort of, you create a balanced interest. An organization has a formal mandate to do this, and then that kind of can prevent drift of the institution, right? It has a pretty specific mandate, and this can work on a local level. You can create an office of basic income at a large city or state government, and their only task is to increase the basic income at a responsible rate. And we already have all the infrastructure kind of in place for this with the tax system in a way. And it's really just an accounting decision. And so I don't think there's that much, you know, when you look at it that way, the bloat, the areas of concern are actually with everything else, the discretionary policy, the other different programs you might introduce to solve various problems that might grow to solve other problems, that kind of thing. But the mandate here is very, very simple. So I think it's naturally resistant to that. And if you sort of frame it that way, that really you're just any efficiency gains that we can get from basic income, just raising it up, and you know, it's sort of it's actually it is the missing balancing force to current institutional drift. So yeah, I think that's sort of how I'm looking at it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. You can look at basic income as kind of this baseline strategy for the government of, this is the default thing that we do, and anything else we do, you have to at least demonstrate why it's better than just doing more basic income or something like that, and then it kind of keeps them honest. Dwight, did you have a comment? I noticed that you unmuted yourself, and I wasn't sure. Let's go to Austin.
Well, I'm just going to.
Or, go ahead, Dwight. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I'm just going to say, one was the experiment in Ontario, which is where I live, and we're talking about other parties changing. It was just a pilot project, so it wasn't legislative thing. It was just a pilot project that was being undertaken. So that's the first thing. The other thing I would like to find out what's happening in Alaska, where they have, I guess, probably the closest thing to a universal basic income in the States on a state level. So what's been happening there? Is there anything that we can learn from that? And concerning the partnership, government, and I guess not for profit or private sector partnership, I'm more inclined to have something like the government running this, only because I think they're accountable ultimately to the populace of the country, but also have maybe like an auditor. We have, for example, an auditor general in Canada, which I'm assuming they have something very similar in the States. And so he'll make comments on how the money's been used, taken out, criticisms. And maybe we could have an auditor general that comments on how we've spent the money or how we've given the money to the people who are subject to the universal basic income. So that's what I'm thinking. Make it very specific that the auditor general is entitled and expected to comment on that area.
Huh. That's interesting. I don't know if we have an equivalent of an auditor general in the United States. I'm trying to think of who that would be or what agency that would be. It sounds like a good idea, though. Yeah. Huh. That's interesting. By the way, I don't know if you're familiar with Zoom has a hand raising feature. So I'll be able to, if you want to talk, and if you click on participants, I think, then you can click raise hand, and then I'll be able to see that you want to speak. And I'll be able to call on you sooner. Go ahead, Austin.
First of all, it's under more, not participants, the hand raising.
Oh, okay.
Feature. Yeah. Second of all, this is totally just brainstorming and spitballing here, because it's an idea I haven't even thought of before. But someone was commenting about the North Dakota Bank. And also this risks drifting into the broader macroeconomic issues that people talk about. But imagine, for example, that we just nationalized all the banks, that you had, that you had the Reserve Bank or the Federal Reserve or whatever still doing what it does, but then all the other banks got merged into one big government-owned bank, which held savings and loans and stuff, right? And then all the interest it received on its loans was the primary source of the basic income. And if you have, a sort of soft currency, MMT, CMT view of the economy, you think that banks charging interest on the money they create is kind of a problem, because it means that, there's always a sort of a net transfer of money into the financial system. So if you could almost sort of remove that effect, and like I'm saying, I'm just thinking of this now, so it's probably not as clever as I think it is. But you could remove that effect by then saying, okay, well, that's the source of our basic income, right? The source of our basic income is all the interest payments that come in, because it's a government-owned bank. We don't want to make a profit. We send out loans. We come back, and what happens at the moment is they put out a loan, and then they take back the payment, and then they delete. That money is deleted from the system, except for the interest. So then that interest could then be put back into the real economy in the form of a basic income. And that could happen, if you had a state bank like the North Dakota Bank, they could do something like that as well.
Yeah, I think at the national level, it doesn't really matter whether you kind of delete the money or not on the balance sheet of the central bank, because as far as the rest of the economy is concerned, that money doesn't exist anymore. But at the state level, I think that's an interesting idea. So you have the loans, and the interest that's paid on the loans can, the state bank doesn't care about earning a profit, but maybe they do need to have revenue from somewhere, and that can be their revenue. The concern is that higher interest rates, of course, correspond to tighter monetary conditions. Maybe that's not such a bad thing if you have a basic income. It can be a little bit tricky if you've got different interest rates in different states. So if the State Bank of North Dakota, we're picking on North Dakota because Dan brought up the North Dakota State Bank in the chat. If the State Bank of North Dakota decided to start charging very high interest rates on all of its loans, people in North Dakota and businesses in North Dakota could just go to other states to borrow money. So I'm not sure that would really be a reasonable source of revenue. And that's how the financial system works anyway. That's how banks operate anyway. If you don't want people to borrow from you, you don't say, no, you're not allowed to borrow. You just say, oh, sure, I'll lend you the money. It's just going to be at this rate that you don't want to pay. So you'll go somewhere else.
Yeah, but here's one thing though. If that interest was then going to people in the form of a basic income, consumer-facing businesses at least would have a reason to stay, since all the consumers are going to have more money. Like, you know what I mean? It would dampen the disincentive, because we're going to be paying all this interest, but so is everybody else. And then all that money ends up in the hands of consumers who can, buy our donuts or whatever the hell we're selling.
Yeah, I don't know about that. I think there might be a little bit of a collective action problem there. So imagine you're in North Dakota, and all of the other businesses are borrowing from the state bank and paying this interest, and everyone's getting a basic income. You can just say, oh, well, maybe that's great. I can benefit from all of this money that's coming in from all of these other businesses, and I can borrow at the cheaper rate from South Dakota, right? So then you have this kind of free rider problem with the businesses, and you end up in a situation where really nobody's borrowing from the state bank, because you get the benefit of the benefit is distributed among everyone, and the costs are specific to you, and you can avoid them. Does that make sense?
Yes, as long if the state bank next door is lending to a business
right
in your area, right? Like, so yeah, I get it.
Right.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Derek, go ahead.
Yeah, those sort of bring up similar concerns to when we talk about tying the funding of a basic income to either like stock performance or sovereign wealth fund, or to a natural resource like oil. It's like, well, that's great. I mean, maybe that's a good excuse to start paying basic income, but then you also face a problem, which is like, well, what if external factors like the resource drying up or the stock's not going so well? Well, then that reduces the basic income, right? Same with people leaving a state, not making those interest payments anymore, or getting the loan somewhere else. It's like, well, does that mean then we have to lower the basic income because we've tied it to this? And so that's sort of a problem. And that's why I think it's sort of better. I think it's better to try to find a way to tie it to existing inefficiencies in the current system, so that as you remove those inefficiencies, you can reward everybody for that. And then there's not really a reason for it to go down, because you're not going to reintroduce those efficiencies. You're not going to start spending in ways that you don't need to spend anymore because people aren't poor, right? If we're thinking about tying the basic income to something other than just, fiat spending, then we're going to want to try to make sure that it's something that always rises, or at least stays the same, and doesn't fall for reasons that have nothing to do with the actual real economic stability of the program.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Let's go to Eddie.
So I'd suggest that if you manage to raise the interest rates within your state, and then your businesses within your state start going to other states to borrow money, I would suggest this is actually a good thing for your state. That means that all of that excess capital that's running around in other states at very, very low rates of interest will be pouring into your state to be invested in your state, because your state has a basic income and your consumers have money to buy the production that results from those investments. Again, it goes back to the entire system, and right now with the Federal Reserve putting too much money at the top, and we're reaching the limit of that situation. Right now, that money is, indirectly going into the stock market. So you end up with a really, really, you end up with companies that are not doing much business. They're not making much profits, but yet the stock markets are sky high. And that's somewhat indirectly because of the low interest rates, because of all the printed money pouring into the entire system. And the danger with that is that, at some point they say the stock market is just crazy, bonds are just crazy, negative rates, zero rates, and the only place, the safe place and the profitable place at some point begins to be that, let's take this capital out of the US dollar, buy gold, and when gold goes up, then that's the only way we can profit in the system, because there's nowhere else to invest, because consumers don't have money to buy things.
Well, I think you're certainly right that higher interest rates might cause businesses to borrow from other states, which would pull money into your own state. But then the question is, if you didn't have the higher interest rates, those businesses would be borrowing at the lower rates anyway. And maybe they'd be borrowing from those other states. Maybe they'd be borrowing within your own state. If they are borrowing within your own state, then that's borrowing that just wouldn't be happening under the higher interest rates. Then that money would just kind of be sitting there, or like nobody would be kind of borrowing within your state. I don't know, and it's tricky, because if you have even within your state, if you have a state bank that has a high interest rate, or like a state central bank that has a high interest rate, how do you prevent the commercial banks in your state from also charging a lower interest rate? So the way the Fed does it is they pay interest on reserves to the commercial banks, so that the commercial banks have no reason to lend at a rate that's any lower than the rate that the Fed is paying them. But then if you're trying to do that at the level of North Dakota, how does the State Bank of North Dakota figure out how to pay all of the North Dakota bank? I mean, like, it just starts to get really complicated really fast, and it's not clear to me that you're actually providing any additional benefit.
The borrowing occurs in our situation because of the addition of the basic income. So because the basic income is flowing out into consumers within the state, that creates demand, which creates demand in turn for productive capacity, for investment. And then in terms of the keeping the leveling the interest rates, again, it goes back to you either have to have your own currency and your own currency policy, or the other option, as a kind of a hack to get around, to fix the system within your own state. If the U.S. refuses to fix the system in the entire U.S., the other hack is to just take the capital from the Federal Reserve directly by selling it, state government bonds, and then using that to bring capital into your state to give out to people as basic income.
Yeah, I think that's certainly doable. If the Federal Reserve is offering to do that, if they're offering to buy up all your debt, then essentially you're just an extension of the.
It's an interesting question. How far is Powell going to go with all this money?
Yeah, and I think your intuition is right, that if you could get a monetary authority managing its own currency at the level of an individual state, and actually get that to be the currency that's used in that state, then you could do some of the stuff you're talking about. I'm skeptical about maybe doing this partway thing, where you have a state bank that's trying to like raise interest rates or something like that, and it's still the same currency and that kind of thing. You really have to kind of go all the way, is my feeling. And my intuition is with Derek. Yeah, and my intuition is with Derek that you're gonna be able to provide more for people as you reduce inefficiencies, as you make the whole system more efficient. There are some potential problems with that as well, since you're in a unified monetary zone. If within your state you make things a lot more efficient, how much of that efficiency benefit gets diffused across the rest of the monetary zone, that kind of thing. Depending on what kind of thing we're talking about, it depends. So that's kind of a tough thing too. Yeah, go ahead, Bethany.
Yeah, I had the same kind of thoughts in terms of the actual incentives of the state. Like some of the benefits that they would gain from basic income would sort of save the money at the level of the state or help things at the level of the state. Others might be diffused. When we have one that Dwight mentioned at the beginning is like criminal justice savings. I don't know enough about how the system works in the US to know like how much of those would accrue to the state and how much would accrue kind of nationally. But those seem significant. And then the other incentive thing I was thinking about is just within the state, all the individual programs, you know, often have an incentive to kind of hold on to the funding that they already have. So something that makes things more efficient, even statewide, can sometimes meet with resistance, which is one of the kind of practical problems that you might have to deal with if people are kind of wise to that, if you're implementing something. I'm thinking, you know, this comes up in my mind when I think about the criminal justice system, because there's a lot of discussion of like private prisons and their incentives in the United States, but it's more pervasive than that to different kinds of institutions wanting to kind of hold on to their money that they get, nonprofit or profit.
Yeah. And Dwight, did you have a comment?
No.
Okay. So I'm going to get to a quote from the article. It'll be our first and final quote this evening. So let's see. The study by 2 Harvard economists found that many programs, especially those focused on children and young adults, made money for taxpayers when all costs and benefits were factored in. That's because they improved the health and education of enrollees and their families who eventually earned more income, paid more taxes, and needed less government assistance overall. So I'm going to go to Bethany because I think you're maybe about to say some of the things I'm going to say.
Oh, I don't know. But what I was going to say is that they start by talking about how states are budget constrained due to COVID-19, but they talk about benefits that accrue over a really long period of time. And so one of the issues is like the state needs to balance its budget today. It can't really not do that potentially just because there might be a benefit 20 years from now, even though that's net efficient for the state in the long run, let alone that whoever's in office now might not be in office 20 years from now, things like that. So there are some issues with incentivizing a state or a nation to do the things that are kind of in the long-term interest. I don't know if that's what you were going to say, but that's part of what stood out to me here.
That's not what I was going to say, but that's a really interesting point. What I was going to say is that I think there's a little bit of a fallacy of composition here. So the fallacy of composition is, you know, everyone's in a baseball stadium. One person stands up, that person has a better view. Everyone stands up, nobody has a better view, and now everyone's standing. So the issue is that, you know, people are educated more when they're younger. When they grow up, they have more income. That's true at the individual level. But if you're, you know, projecting 30 years out, you know, based on what people are, you know, the benefits people get when they're younger, that's all well and good. But really 30 years out, the amount of income that people are going to have in aggregate is going to be largely determined by economic policy. It's not going to be determined by how educated people were when they're young. That's more of a relative thing. That's how you get ahead relative to other people in the economy. The economy as a whole is going to be balanced through economic policy that modulates the amount of income people have and the amount of spending they're able to undertake. So my sense is that there are some benefits in this. There are some things in this article that make sense, where you talk about kind of what Derek was getting at. You talk about saving resources from, you know, not having to do inefficient, you know, healthcare and that kind of thing. But the idea that somehow you can boost everybody's income by educating them more, it doesn't answer the question of where the money comes from, right? The money still has to kind of come from the government. It has to come from economic policy on some level. Austin, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not so sure I agree with that. First of all, because when we're talking about increasing efficiency, there's increasing efficiency in terms of the public spending, but there's also increasing efficiency in the private sector. And if you have a really educated workforce, they're going to make more, you know, technological innovations, and the economy as a whole will grow. And I think then there's also the thing of group competition. So if you look at states like countries, right? They're competing with each other, and the state that has the most educated workforce will outcompete the other states to some extent and get more economic activity happening inside its borders. Then everybody does that. The whole country ends up more educated. And even without competition, that means, more education means, you're going to be more productive, right? Like if people know how to use technology, they can revolutionize any industry using that technology and make it more productive. And I think you'd find that the highest per income, if you remove places like Saudi Arabia or whatever that have oil revenues or whatever, the highest income per capita countries would also be amongst the most educated. And I think there is a causal relationship there, probably, that education does grow the economy in the long term. And it probably grows it. I would say that it grows it so much you could even like take on debt and be able to pay off the interest, even if you're borrowing it on private money markets.
So I agree with you that education is great, and I think there's probably some effect of, the more educated the people are, the more productive our economy is going to be, that kind of thing. That would be more true if we lived in a world with an efficient labor market, such that we're only employing people because we want the product of their labor. But the world that we live in now is that we're using economic policy to create jobs that are not necessarily efficient, not necessarily productive, as a way of pushing money to people, right? Yeah.
I'd just add as well, you're probably going to get people voting for smarter policies and more likely to vote for a basic income and more likely to vote for sophisticated economic policies if they're more educated as well. If they're not educated, they're more likely to believe in something like the household fallacy, and that the government's got, that welfare dollars are coming out of my taxes, and all of these sort of simple but untrue things will be more convincing to an uneducated population as well. So, and you see that too, like the more educated countries have more generous social spending.
I agree with you that more education is good. I'm not sold on kind of the argument in the article, because I think, we tend to, the argument in the article might make more sense if we lived in a world with an efficient labor market, if we already had basic income at kind of its natural level for the economy, and everyone was kind of able to activate the economy's full potential. Now you educate people more. That allows you to have a higher basic income in the future because you have more productive potential in the future. So I think that part is true. I think that's true, but I think the context in which they're looking at things, in the article, they're analyzing the government as being budget constrained, and we're taking this analysis and kind of looking at it at the level of an individual state. I don't know that educating people more at the level of an individual state is going to increase people's, well, maybe like you were saying, like if one state does it, that puts them ahead of other states and that kind of thing. I don't know. I think it's a little more nuanced than what they get at the article.
Real quick.
Go ahead.
Real quick, I wanted to respond to something else Bethany said about institutional incentives. So an institution wants to hold on to its funding. It's becoming very clear to me that in Australia, this is a big blocker to a basic income in the form of labor unions. So we have a relatively strong labor movement in Australia, which has a whole bunch of benefits for workers, but they want to be the organization that takes care of workers. They don't want a basic income to take care of workers, because then that means that workers are less reliant on them for protection because they have income outside of jobs. And the organization is meant to be a means to the ends of protecting workers and ordinary people, but it also, the means complicates the end because the labor union itself wants to grow as an organization, and so doesn't necessarily want people to have independent leverage rather than collective leverage.
Yeah. So there's lots of interesting wrinkles there. So we've got a lot of people with their hands up, and we're getting towards the end. So I want to go around and get people's final thoughts. So we're going to start with Derek, and then we're going to go Martin, and then Eddie.
This is really great. I liked a lot of the points brought up here on this about this topic. I mean, I think at the end of the day, either poverty is cheap and saves you money, or it's expensive. And if it's expensive, I think that we live in a world where we're already spending heaps of money, local governments too, on problems that maybe we don't need to spend as much money on. So I know there are challenges with like needing to balance budgets, but I'm not familiar again with exactly what the current restrictions are on that. I don't know if there is a window to get people thinking about, under what time constraint do we have, right? We can't really, the 20 years isn't going to work long term if those where the savings show up. But I can imagine it being possible that basic income would create savings over the course of a fiscal year. If you're really poor, you can really quickly run into needing expensive emergency services. You can get took into the criminal justice system like that. And then if you have money, your problems can be solved really quickly. You can just go to the store down the street and buy the thing that you need, right? So I don't know. I think it's worth considering that there's a way to actually save money from the budget with basic income to next month, next year. And if that's true, it may be possible to argue local policymakers in that direction.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Let's go Martin, Eddie, and then Richard.
So I like the element in the article that is, if it's more cost effective, or if it could be more cost effective, why wouldn't you do it? And I was actually surprised in the article where another point was made about, but this might be done for a social justice, or we talked early in the meeting, whether it's fairness or some other sort of moral consideration. And I say I was disappointed to hear that in the article, coming on the heels of why wouldn't we do this if it makes fiscal sense, is because I have this notion: do all the things that make complete fiscal sense as low-hanging fruit. Don't fight it. Don't fight it to make a principle on some other thing, like, but now we're not doing it for some justice reason. Okay, do it anyway. Get rid of all the low-hanging fruit. And to that, a couple of ideas that I've expressed in earlier meetings, and I'll just sort of re-echo it today. Things like taxing billionaires. Tax billionaires 100% right after they die. Okay, but if you're going to tax billionaires, tax Bill Gates differently than the two or three Walton billionaires that are currently on, the Forbes, whatever, most massively wealthy list. Why? Bill Gates was the founder of, and I realize that, people could still look at that and say, yeah, but why does any economy need to produce somebody that? Well, I get it. Okay. But Bill Gates was the individual who founded and grew the company. The living Waltons are not. Their father, from whom they inherited all that money, is not around anymore. Similarly, don't tax billionaire Jeff Bezos. At least don't tax him first. First tax Abigail Johnson. Why Abigail Johnson? Because Abigail Johnson's father, Ned Johnson, founded Fidelity Investments, and that's where Abigail's billions come from. Yes, Abigail is the CEO, but Jack Walsh was the CEO of General Electric, and I suspect if you look over the periods of growth of General Electric and Fidelity Investments under Abigail Johnson, you might find similar growth in a lot of ways, but Abigail's a billionaire, and Jack Walsh was only, a very wealthy guy, multimillionaire. So you can sort of look at that, and I look at that as, this notion of societally, we have this idea of it's okay to be an American, be born equal, and make it on your own. And so we should be able to sell the idea that billionaires like Walton, shouldn't pass his billions down to a couple of his kids. I don't say that solves all our problems. I'm just trying to re-echo this idea of low-hanging fruit. The stuff that we already think of as completely acceptable within our society, if you can frame basic income or some elements of it in the same principles that Republican and Democrats all accept, even if they don't believe they accept it, but they already do. Take the low-hanging fruit and score where you can.
Yeah, well, I certainly like the idea of going after the low-hanging fruit first. We might disagree about what those fruit are, but that's a discussion for another time. Let's go to Eddie, Richard, and then Austin.
So I want to stress again how counterintuitive our situation is. Most people think if society is poor, then society needs to save more, spend less, and then they'll become more wealthy. And some very smart economists, Keynes in the 30s and Milton Friedman in the 60s or 70s pointed out that in certain situations the problem is not that we're saving too little, it's that we're saving too much, or rather that we're consuming too little. That counterintuitively, the reason we're so poor is we're not spending enough money, there's solutions for that where, Keynes said, the government could bury, big barrels of cash in mine shafts and have people, dig down to get the cash and have that be their job. And that would help the economy. And Friedman said, if you don't have enough aggregate demand, you should get in a helicopter, bring lots of cash and shower it down on people from the sky, and that will give you the aggregate demand when people have money to spend. It's completely counterintuitive, and it's exactly where we are. Not enough consumption. The funny thing about billionaires is that the great sin is that when you're, with this economy, with this, money economy, supposedly you make stuff, you get money, and then you take your money and you spend it on other stuff. And the great problem that billionaires create is they produce billions and billions of dollars of production, and there's no way they could ever spend that. And at the same time, the economy doesn't have a way for other people to consume that production. And so you end up with too much production, not enough consumption. So that's what I mean when I say it doesn't really matter whether you tax billionaires, because they're going to spend the same amount anyways. They're not going to spend any less when you tax them. On the other hand, I would say that the government is in a bit of a poor fiscal situation, and the government could use those taxes. The government could use those taxes to make its situation more stable and not have to, at least on a nominal basis, not have to be nominally borrowing, huge amounts of money, which can end up destabilizing the system when people start to believe that the government will not be able to pay back that money without devaluing the currency, which can become self-fulfilling prophecy.
Okay.
So do tax the billionaires.
A lot of thoughts for the future. Let's go to Richard, Austin, and then Dwight.
Well, something like the GI Fund after World War II created a ton of educated workers that greatly benefited the economy. But I like the Buckminster Fuller quote, where you can have one really gifted person provide enough for 10,000 normal people with just one invention. So with our education system is going, we're creating a lot of mediocre people when we could just create some really fantastic schools for gifted people that would benefit the entire economy with that. And our politicians are not focused on the long term. They're always thinking about the short term. How can I get to win the next election? So we need them to think about the long term and how something like China's 5-year plans or something like that. That's really how you can change the economy and go towards a certain goal, like with Kennedy and the space program. Let's get to the moon.
Yeah, the trick is to have a Cold War and need to beat the Soviets at something. That's what we got to do. Let's go to Austin, Dwight, and then Bethany.
Hey, so I'm going to be contrarian as usual. So I know that I think what Steve and Alex have both been getting at, is this idea that our moral systems or our sense of fairness can gum up or get in the way of implementing policies that we think are economically rational. And that makes sense. I think that's also the case with a bit of what Eddie's saying, that our intuition is you have to be a virtuous saver to not be poor. And what I think is that, our intuitions are wrong and we actually have to change them. It's like, so rather than the low-hanging fruit metaphor, one metaphor you can use is from martial arts, right? Like, so my Taekwondo instructor, when I was a kid doing Taekwondo, used to always say, strike for the center of the body, right? Like going for like a wrist lock or some kind of like clever move like that is an advanced technique. When you're trying to pull something off, the easiest thing to do is strike for the center of the body because that's the hardest place for the opponent to move, right? And that's where that's how you actually make contact. So what you have to do is confront these things at the level of, the philosophical groundings and the ideology behind it. And that's where I think, a basic income can't be separated from these broader discussions about what's a life well lived, what's a valuable person, what is good, right? And so sort of saying go for the low-hanging fruit and do what people will agree to. Sometimes you'll end up doing things that aren't actually what you want. Like, so this idea that, well, let's go for the stuff that makes fiscal sense. But actually, maybe what makes fiscal sense doesn't make fiscal sense. Maybe shrinking government spending, even if we shrink government spending by introducing a basic income so we don't have to pay as many social workers and we don't have to pay as many prison guards and stuff, well, then we've lost the wages of the social workers and the prison guards, right? Whereas if we say, no, the reason we want a basic income is because the government needs to spend more anyhow, people might go, what the fuck, you're crazy. But at least once you convince them, you've actually convinced them of something that's true. You haven't spent all this time trying to sort of twist yourself into knots to argue for something you don't really believe. That's all.
Okay. Yeah, I think some of these points make sense differently at the national level versus the state level that's more budget constrained. Let's go to Dwight and then Bethany and then Dan. So Dwight, you got to unmute yourself.
Am I unmuted?
Sorry, yes, you're good. Oh, now you're muted again. You had it a second ago. There you go.
Okay, am I okay? Yeah, I was just saying with regard to the last person's statement, well, we might lose the jobs of social workers, etc. Well, I think we're assuming that skills aren't transferable. So I'm not sure that if you lose it in one area, you can't bring it to another area in the first case. The second thing is I wanted to mention is I tend to like to have more conceptual like examples as opposed to theory. So I would like to learn a little bit more what happened in Alaska, what's their downfall, and understand what's the major objection to universal basic income. So are people saying that it'll turn people lazy and not want to work? Is it because they think it'll give us a deficit in the country's revenue? What's the underlying reason why there's resistance? And that'll help people to understand what we need to really address in this issue. Because I don't think in principle, people mind a universal basic income if it does something, if it doesn't affect their situation, or if it doesn't, it will show that there's less crime or whatever, but they need something to hang their hat on. And I think it's important that we figure out what kind of angle we're selling this on, as much as we have the theoretical. Because once when I was doing this universal basic income, I thought about everybody was getting it, whether you were rich or poor, you're receiving a certain basic income. When I hear this conversation, I'm not quite sure that's the meaning that you're all giving to it. So
yes, that is what we mean.
You mean everybody gets it?
Yep.
regardless of income.
Yes.
Okay, so we need to check how that will work. Why are we advocating that everybody gets it regardless of income? Is it to appease the group in terms of selling it, or we really think that they need it as well? So that's something that I would like to understand a little better, because one of the things we do in Canada, for example, is we don't call it a guaranteed basic income, but we call it income supplement. So we'll look at the person's income from last year and then top it up. Okay, so whether it be a pension or old age security or just income or paying less on our sales tax, any of those avenues can be topped up or taken off less, but it's based on the historical. So how they did in the last year. So whereas this seems to be you're giving out money and then let everybody do what they want to do, and it doesn't matter what how they've used it or the historical underpinnings. So I'm just wondering if that's something that we want to look at as well, or we just want to say give them the money, it's completely free, or there's going to be some conditions.
Yeah, I mean, I think you just brought up a lot of points that are central to the debate about basic income. I think part of the problem, part of where the objections to basic income come from is that a lot of the people who are advocating for basic income are maybe not talking about it in the right way, or not talking about it in the way that I would like. So I tend to think about basic income as just solving the problem of how to get spending money to consumers. And that's something that's necessary for a functioning market economy. So the way we currently do it is we do a lot of things, but we overstimulate the financial sector to make it easier for businesses to borrow, to create jobs for people. So a lot of times, you might think you're earning your money in your job, but maybe your job wouldn't have existed if we weren't using economic policy to create jobs. Maybe your employer's business wouldn't have existed if we weren't doing that. So a lot of times what's actually happening is that the government is handing people money. They're just hiding it behind the fact that they're also indirectly creating jobs for people. So we can simplify the whole process. I've actually written a couple articles about that. I can reach out to you, and you might be interested in reading it. But it's less about kind of a safety net or targeting poor people, and it's more about like fundamental infrastructure. Like everybody gets healthcare, everybody gets income, everybody gets roads and bridges, right? So basic income is kind of part of that. So let's go to, or does that make
one
sense?
question though,
Yeah.
why does somebody who's rich though, or let's say has $200,000, how is that going to help them stimulate the income? If that's the basis for it, why do they need that extra $1,500 a month to help stimulate income? Why do they need it?
Yeah, it's not that they need it. It's that it's a general piece of infrastructure for the economy as a whole. And giving money to that person isn't going to reduce the amount of money that you can give to everyone else. That's something that's important. So it actually takes resources to try to target billionaires. And as it turns out, the people who are least equipped to prove that they're not billionaires are the poorest people, because they're the ones who don't have the resources to navigate the system. So you really want to keep it simple. If you do want to target rich people, I would usually recommend doing that on the taxation side. So instead of not giving them the money, just tax them more, for example, if you wanted to. Yeah. But we're kind of getting to the end of our time here, and I want to get to everyone else's final comments, but I could talk about this forever, and I'm happy to talk about this with you more later. Let's go to Bethany, and then Dan, and then Elizabeth.
Hey, yeah, I liked your point about the fallacy of composition. I think Austin already pointed this out, but some of the things in the article I think wouldn't have that fallacy, like people having better health just helps them be more productive across anything that they do. They talk about health benefits, and also means that they don't require different kinds of health resources, similar with criminal justice resources. Like there are real resources that either could or could not be used up based on some of the benefits, even though I agree with your point about incomes maybe being kind of like a fallacy of composition issue. So that was the point I had my hand raised for. Yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting things that come up with both incentives and budgets when it comes to a state level basic income, but it still seems like there could be a valuable role for it based on this discussion. So thanks everyone.
Yeah, good stuff. And hi, Annabelle. Bethany is holding our daughter, Annabelle, who was born a couple weeks ago. She's 2 weeks old today. There she is. Yeah. Let's go to Dan and then Elizabeth.
Yeah, another great discussion. Yeah, my final quick thoughts are, I think a state basic income is definitely a good tool to have. I definitely think the national basic income is the most effective. But I do think that a state basic income has a great chance of becoming a reality if it's focused on anti-poverty. I know we generally talk about basic income in a much broader sense, which I totally agree with. But I think at the state level, with a budget constraint, and again, what we were talking about, where you can frame it as this will save us money in the long term, again, for something that's budget constrained, that looks very attractive. And I think even if it's smaller, it's something great to have if you have a national basic income on top of it. So yeah, those are my closing thoughts, and congrats.
Thank you. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
I appreciated Derek's point about how expensive it is to be poor, and that feels like a really compelling reason to try to do a basic income sort of separate from like, oh, is this like the most fiscally responsible thing that we could do, but sort of like, this is a highly effective anti-poverty measure. This is a highly effective way to improve people's lives. Universal basic income feels to me like okay, the problem we're trying to solve is that people are poor, that people don't have enough money. And like, yeah, we're giving some of it to rich people because of your point about how means testing just is not just inefficient, but disproportionately penalizes people. If you're like, whatever system you try to come up with, it's like, oh, historical, it's like, okay, but what if I lost my job this year? Like, do I have to wait until next year to get that topped off? Like, how do you build a system? And there's always going to be people who fall through the cracks. So it feels to me like okay, if we can give money to people, we should do that. And then if we have balanced budget constraints, then we can figure out some way to then tax it back or see if it balances out or something. But that giving money to people should be the first priority, to be like, okay, that's going to improve people's well-being. They're going to have money to be able to, they can do what they need with it. So rather than trying to target social services and say, okay, can we figure out what people need? We can just give people money and they can say, oh, here, like, I know what I need is more food or, mental health resources or, whatever it is that they need. They can take that money and use it as they see fit. And then we can see how that changes the landscape.
Yeah. So this is a good conversation. My intuition is that, a city level basic income is good if you don't have a state level basic income, and that a state level basic income is good if you don't have a national basic income, and that a national basic income is good if you don't have a global basic income. But my sense is also that once you have the higher level of basic income, if it's at a high enough level, then you don't need the more localized versions. But I'm happy to kind of debate people on that topic as well. So this was fun. Next week's topic, we're going to go back in time. We're going to have a historical one. We're going to talk about the hyperinflation in the 1920s in Weimar Germany and what the mechanisms were there behind that. And, kind of putting it in a basic income frame, if we're thinking about a basic income as a possibility in the economic policy mix, how could that have maybe changed things? So that's it. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Alex.